The dusty streets of Ouagadougou buzzed with morning energy as vendors arranged their colorful fabrics and fresh produce. Among the crowd, a young soldier walked quietly, his worn boots creating small clouds of red earth with each step. Nobody recognized him as Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the man who would soon shake the foundations of West African politics. Ibrahim had grown up in these same streets, watching his mother sell vegetables to support their family. His father worked as a security guard at a local bank, earning barely enough to keep food on their table. The family lived in a small concrete house with corrugated metal roofing that leaked during the rainy season. Yet despite their struggles, Ibrahim's parents always emphasized education and honesty above everything else. As a child, Ibrahim witnessed the stark contrast between the poor neighborhoods where he lived and the wealthy districts where government officials built their mansions. He saw how foreign mining companies extracted gold and other precious metals from Burkina Faso's soil, while local people remained trapped in poverty. These early observations planted seeds of questions in his young mind about fairness and justice. His academic brilliance earned him a scholarship to study geology at the University of Ouagadougou. While his classmates focused solely on their studies, Ibrahim spent his evenings reading about economics, political theory, and African history. He learned about Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader who had been assassinated in 1987, just 2 years before Ibrahim was born. Sankara's vision of African self-reliance and his fight against corruption resonated deeply with the young student. During university, Ibrahim made an unexpected discovery that would change everything. While conducting geological surveys for his thesis, he stumbled upon evidence of massive undocumented mineral deposits in remote regions of the country. The surveys revealed not just gold, but rare earth minerals essential for modern technology, elements worth potentially billions of dollars. More shocking was his realization that foreign companies had been secretly extracting these resources for years, without proper compensation to the government or people of Burkina Faso. After graduation, Ibrahim made a decision that surprised his family and friends. Instead of pursuing a lucrative career in mining or geology, he joined the military. His parents worried about his choice, but Ibrahim knew he needed to understand power structures from within the system. He wanted to serve his country and protect its resources from exploitation. His military training took him to different parts of Burkina Faso, where he witnessed firsthand how international corporations operated with impunity. He saw French companies controlling uranium mines, Canadian firms extracting gold, and Chinese businesses taking rare earth minerals. Meanwhile, local communities received almost nothing in return, and government officials seemed more interested in personal enrichment than national development. Ibrahim's geological knowledge proved invaluable during his military service. He was assigned to units responsible for border security and resource protection, giving him access to classified information about the true extent of the country's mineral wealth. What he discovered was staggering. Burkina Faso possessed enough natural resources to transform from one of the world's poorest countries into a prosperous nation, if only these resources were properly managed and fairly distributed. The young officer began building a network of like-minded individuals within the military and civilian sectors. He connected with other soldiers who shared his concerns about foreign exploitation, economists who understood the potential for national development, and community leaders who had witnessed the negative impacts of resource extraction in their regions. This growing network would later become the foundation of a movement that would reshape the country's future. Ibrahim's reputation as an intelligent and principled officer grew within military circles. His superiors respected his tactical skills and dedication to duty, while his subordinates admired his fairness and genuine care for their welfare. Unlike many officers who lived comfortably while enlisted soldiers struggled, Ibrahim shared the hardships of military life and used his family connections to ensure his men had adequate food and equipment. During international peacekeeping missions in Mali and other neighboring countries, Ibrahim observed how different nations managed their natural resources. He studied successful models of resource management in countries like Norway and Botswana, while also learning from the failures of nations that had fallen victim to the resource curse, though the paradox where countries with abundant natural wealth remained poor due to corruption and mismanagement. The more Ibrahim learned about global economics and resource politics, the more convinced he became that Burkina Faso needed fundamental change. He realized that the country's poverty was not inevitable or natural, but rather the result of systematic exploitation by foreign interests working in collaboration with corrupt local elites. This understanding fueled his determination to find ways to break these destructive patterns. His personal life remained simple and focused. While other successful young men his age pursued wealth and luxury, Ibrahim lived modestly, sending most of his military salary to support his parents and younger siblings. He married his university sweetheart, a teacher named Ajara, who shared his values and supported his vision for a better Burkina Faso. Together, they raised their children to understand both the challenges and potential of their homeland. As Ibrahim advanced through military ranks, he began developing detailed plans for how Burkina Faso could reclaim control of its natural resources and use them for national development rather than foreign enrichment. He studied successful resource nationalization efforts in other countries, learning both from victories and mistakes. These plans remained hidden, shared only with his most trusted allies, as they represented a direct challenge to the established order that had enriched foreign corporations and local collaborators for decades. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Ibrahim had learned and planned. The established powers had no idea that a young officer from humble beginnings possessed both the knowledge and determination to challenge their control over one of Africa's most resource-rich nations. Ibrahim's journey from a poor neighborhood in Ouagadougou to the corridors of military and political power had prepared him for the battles ahead, but the true test of his vision was yet to come. The meeting room in the presidential palace felt heavy with tension as President Roch Kabore shuffled through intelligence reports. Foreign mining executives sat around the polished mahogany table, their expensive suits contrasting sharply with the modest dress of local officials. They were discussing the latest security threats to their operations, but none of them realized that their biggest challenge was quietly building strength within the very military meant to protect them. Ibrahim had spent months carefully observing these power dynamics. His position in military intelligence gave him access to confidential communications between government officials and foreign corporations. What he discovered shocked even him. The extent of corruption was far worse than he had imagined. Government ministers were receiving regular payments from mining companies, while contracts were structured to give foreign firms ownership of resources for decades at prices far below market value. The young officer began documenting everything systematically. He collected evidence of illegal mining operations, recorded conversations between corrupt officials, and mapped out the complex web of relationships between foreign corporations and local politicians. His geological expertise allowed him to calculate the true value of resources being extracted, revealing that Burkina Faso was losing billions of dollars annually through these corrupt arrangements. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens struggled with rising food prices, lack of clean water, and inadequate health care. Ibrahim witnessed families forced to choose between sending their children to school or buying medicine for sick relatives. These daily realities strengthened his resolve to challenge the system that prioritized foreign profits over local welfare. His network of allies had grown significantly. Military officers from different regions shared similar concerns about national sovereignty and resource exploitation. Civilian professionals, teachers, doctors, engineers, and small business owners expressed frustration with their country's development trajectory despite its natural wealth. Religious leaders from both Muslim and Christian communities began quietly supporting calls for change. Seeing the moral imperative to fight against corruption and exploitation, Ibrahim knew that any attempt to challenge the established order would face fierce resistance. Foreign corporations had invested billions in their Burkina Faso operations and would not surrender their advantages easily. Local elites who had enriched themselves through these relationships would fight to maintain their privileged positions. International powers that benefited from cheap access to strategic resources would likely intervene to protect their interests. The breakthrough moment came during a routine military patrol near the Mali border. Ibrahim's unit discovered an illegal mining operation run by a shell company connected to a major French corporation. Local communities had been displaced without compensation, and toxic chemicals from the mining process were contaminating water sources used by nearby villages. When Ibrahim attempted to report this through official channels, his superiors ordered him to ignore the situation and focus on other duties. This incident crystallized Ibrahim's understanding that the current system could not be reformed from within. It required fundamental transformation. He began reaching out to international contacts he had met during peacekeeping missions, building relationships with African leaders who had successfully challenged foreign exploitation of their country's resources. These discussions provided valuable insights into strategies for resource nationalization and economic independence. The planning phase intensified as Ibrahim and his allies developed detailed strategies for taking control of key government institutions and economic assets. They studied successful coups and revolutions from around the world, learning from both victories and failures. The team included military strategists, economists, legal experts, and community organizers, each contributing specialized knowledge to the overall plan. Security became a critical concern as the group's activities expanded. Foreign intelligence services and local security forces were known to monitor potential threats to the established order. Ibrahim implemented strict operational security measures, using coded communications and cell-based organizational structures to minimize the risk of discovery. Only a small core group knew the full extent of the plans, while other participants were given specific tasks without complete knowledge of the broader operation. Public sentiment was shifting in ways that favored change. Rising inflation, unemployment, and corruption scandals had eroded confidence in President Kabore's government. Youth unemployment reached alarming levels, with university graduates unable to find work, while foreign companies imported workers for skilled positions in mining and other industries. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions about inequality and foreign exploitation, creating an atmosphere receptive to calls for transformation. Ibrahim's personal transformation during this period was remarkable. The young officer who had once focused primarily on his military duties now spent countless hours studying economics, international law, and political strategy. He learned to speak multiple languages to communicate directly with international partners and understand complex financial documents. His wife Ajara noticed the change, supporting his mission while worrying about the dangers he faced. The economic intelligence Ibrahim gathered revealed stunning details about resource extraction in Burkina Faso. Gold exports alone generated billions in revenue annually, but most profits flowed to foreign shareholders, while local communities received minimal benefits. Uranium deposits essential for nuclear power generation were controlled by French companies through contracts negotiated decades earlier at disadvantageous terms. Rare earth minerals crucial for electronic devices were extracted by Chinese firms with little environmental oversight or community consultation. Ibrahim began developing alternative economic models that would prioritize national development over foreign enrichment. He studied successful resource management strategies from countries like Norway, which had used oil revenues to build a massive sovereign wealth fund, and Botswana, which had negotiated fair partnerships with diamond companies. These examples demonstrated that resource-rich, developing countries could achieve prosperity if they maintained control over their natural assets. The psychological pressure of leading a clandestine movement while maintaining his public role as a loyal military officer was immense. Ibrahim had to carefully balance his duties as a soldier with his preparation for revolutionary change. He attended official meetings with government and military leaders while secretly planning their replacement. This double life required exceptional discipline and emotional control. International connections became increasingly important as the movement prepared for action. Ibrahim established relationships with African leaders who had successfully challenged foreign economic dominance, learning from their experiences and gaining potential allies for the struggles ahead. He also connected with international organizations focused on resource justice and economic sovereignty, understanding that global support would be crucial for any successful transformation. The final preparations were meticulous and comprehensive. Every major government building, military installation, and economic facility was surveyed and assigned to specific teams. Communication systems were established to coordinate simultaneous actions across the country. Contingency plans were developed for various scenarios, including potential foreign intervention or internal resistance from entrenched interests. As the moment for action approached, Ibrahim reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. From his humble beginnings in Ouagadougou to his current position as leader of a revolutionary movement, every experience had prepared him for the challenges ahead. The geological knowledge that revealed his country's hidden wealth, the military training that taught him strategy and leadership, and the personal values instilled by his parents all converged in this decisive moment that would determine Burkina Faso's future direction. The radio crackled with static as dawn broke over Ouagadougou on a January 24, 2022. Citizens preparing for another ordinary day suddenly heard an unexpected announcement that would change everything. A calm voice declared that the military had taken control of the government, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré's name was mentioned among the leaders of this historic transformation. The operation had unfolded with remarkable precision during the pre-dawn hours. While most of the capital slept, carefully coordinated teams of soldiers moved silently to secure key government buildings, military installations, and strategic infrastructure. The presidential palace, national television station, airport, and major roads were all under military control before sunrise. Years of meticulous planning had paid off in a bloodless transition that surprised even experienced political observers. Ibrahim stood in the national television studio, preparing to address his fellow citizens for the first time as a leader, rather than a soldier following orders. The weight of responsibility felt enormous as he considered the millions of people whose lives would be affected by the decisions made in the coming days and months. Everything he had studied, planned, and dreamed about would now be tested in the harsh reality of governing a complex nation. His first public speech was deliberately simple and direct, delivered in the local languages that ordinary citizens understood best. Ibrahim explained that the military had acted to protect Burkina Faso's sovereignty and resources from continued exploitation. He promised that the changes would benefit all citizens, not just a privileged few who had profited from corruption. The message resonated powerfully with people who had grown frustrated with poverty amid their country's natural wealth. International reactions came swiftly and predictably. Western governments condemned the military takeover and threatened economic sanctions, while regional African leaders called for dialogue and peaceful resolution. Foreign mining companies saw their stock prices plummet as investors worried about potential nationalization of assets. The French government, with extensive business interests in Burkina Faso, immediately began diplomatic efforts to influence the situation. Ibrahim had anticipated these responses and prepared accordingly. His team included economists who had developed detailed plans for managing international pressure while implementing necessary reforms. They understood that challenging entrenched foreign interests would provoke strong reactions, but they were prepared to accept short-term difficulties in exchange for long-term national benefits. The new government's first major action sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms worldwide. Ibrahim announced a comprehensive audit of all mining and resource extraction contracts signed by previous governments. Foreign companies were required to provide complete documentation of their operations, financial records, and agreements with local officials. Any contracts found to be disadvantageous to national interests would be renegotiated or terminated. This announcement triggered panic among foreign executives who had enjoyed decades of profitable operations under favorable terms. Legal teams scrambled to review contracts that many companies had assumed were secure for years to come. The prospect of losing access to valuable resources or paying higher royalties threatened billions in projected profits, leading to intense lobbying efforts and diplomatic pressure. Ibrahim's geological expertise proved invaluable during this period. Unlike previous leaders who had relied on advisors and consultants, he personally understood the technical aspects of mining operations and the true value of extracted resources. This knowledge allowed him to identify unfair contract terms and calculate appropriate compensation levels that would benefit his country while remaining economically viable for foreign partners willing to operate transparently. The domestic response was overwhelmingly positive among ordinary citizens. Markets and streets buzzed with excited conversations about the possibility of real change. Young people especially embraced the new leadership, seeing hope for better economic opportunities and reduced corruption. However, Wealthy elites and those connected to foreign businesses expressed concerns about potential disruption to their privileged positions. Ibrahim's personal approach to leadership differed dramatically from his predecessors. Instead of moving into luxurious government accommodations, he maintained his modest lifestyle and continued living in the same simple house with his family. Government vehicles were used only for official duties, and lavish ceremonies were replaced with practical working meetings. These symbolic gestures reinforced his commitment to serving the people rather than enriching himself. The economic transformation began immediately with practical measures that citizens could see and feel. Government revenues from mining operations were redirected toward education, healthcare, and infrastructure development, instead of flowing into private accounts. Construction projects began in previously neglected rural areas, and scholarship programs were established to help talented young people pursue higher education without leaving the country. Foreign intelligence services and diplomatic missions worked overtime to understand and influence the new government. Traditional methods of pressure and persuasion had little effect on leaders who had anticipated these tactics and remained focused on their nationalist agenda. Ibrahim's military background and security awareness made it difficult for foreign actors to find vulnerabilities they could exploit. The renegotiation of mining contracts proceeded methodically and professionally. Ibrahim insisted on transparency throughout the process, publishing key details so citizens could understand how their country's resources were being managed. Companies willing to accept fair terms and operate transparently were welcomed as partners, while those demanding continued preferential treatment faced potential expulsion from the country. Several major corporations initially resisted the new requirements, expecting that international pressure would force a return to previous arrangements. However, Ibrahim's government remained firm in its positions while demonstrating flexibility on implementation timelines and technical details. This balanced approach gradually convinced some companies that cooperation offered better long-term prospects than confrontation. The key success of early reforms encouraged Ibrahim to accelerate additional changes. Educational curricula were revised to include more information about African history and economics, reducing dependence on foreign textbooks and perspectives. Local languages received greater official recognition, and government services became more accessible to citizens who were not fluent in French. These cultural changes reinforced the broader theme of national sovereignty and self-determination. Regional dynamics became increasingly important as neighboring countries watched Burkina Faso's transformation with interest. Some African leaders privately expressed support for Ibrahim's nationalist approach, while others worried about potential spillover effects on their own relationships with foreign powers. The situation created new opportunities for South-South cooperation and reduced dependence on traditional Western partnerships. Ibrahim's international outreach focused heavily on building relationships with other African countries and non-Western powers. China, Russia, Turkey, and India all expressed interest in developing partnerships with Burkina Faso under more balanced terms than those offered by traditional Western partners. These alternative relationships provided leverage in negotiations with European and North American companies. The transformation was not without challenges and setbacks. Some foreign companies withdrew from the country rather than accept new terms, temporarily reducing government revenues and employment in certain sectors. International sanctions complicated trade relationships and limited access to some technologies and markets. However, Ibrahim's team had prepared contingency plans for these difficulties and worked systematically to minimize their impact. That public support remained strong as citizens began experiencing tangible improvements in their daily lives. New schools and health clinics opened in remote areas that had been ignored by previous governments. Road construction projects connected isolated communities to national markets, enabling farmers and small businesses to expand their operations. These practical achievements demonstrated that the changes were producing real benefits rather than just political rhetoric. The psychological impact of the transformation was perhaps even more significant than the material changes. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso citizens felt that their government prioritized national interests over foreign demands. This renewed sense of dignity and sovereignty energized people across all sectors of society, creating momentum for continued reforms and development efforts. 9 months after taking power, Ibrahim faced his greatest test yet, a coordinated conspiracy involving disgruntled military officers, wealthy businessmen with foreign connections, and external intelligence operatives threatened to undo everything his government had accomplished. The plot was discovered just hours before its planned execution, forcing Ibrahim to make decisions that would determine whether his vision for Burkina Faso would survive or collapse. The conspiracy had been carefully planned by forces who understood that direct military intervention or economic pressure alone would not dislodge Ibrahim's popular government. Instead, they orchestrated a complex operation designed to create chaos and justify international intervention. Key military installations would be attacked by disguised forces, creating the appearance of civil war. Simultaneously, economic sabotage would disrupt essential services, while propaganda campaigns would blame the instability on Ibrahim's nationalist policies. Intelligence sources revealed that foreign private military contractors had been infiltrating the country for weeks, establishing hidden bases and weapons caches. Some were disguised as international aid workers or business consultants, while others had crossed porous borders from neighboring countries where they had received training and equipment. The sophistication of the operation indicated substantial financial backing and professional planning that went far beyond local capabilities. Ibrahim's response demonstrated the strategic thinking that had brought him to power. Rather than simply arresting the conspirators and calling for international support, he decided to turn the crisis into an opportunity to accelerate his country's transformation. The failed coup attempt would provide justification for more radical reforms while exposing the true nature of foreign interference in African affairs. The revelation of the conspiracy triggered massive public demonstrations supporting Ibrahim's government. Citizens who had initially been uncertain about the military takeover now saw clear evidence that foreign powers were actively working to undermine their country's sovereignty. The attempted coup backfired by strengthening national unity and providing popular legitimacy for more dramatic changes to Burkina Faso's economic and political systems. Ibrahim used the crisis to implement sweeping reforms that might have been politically difficult under normal circumstances. Foreign-owned businesses connected to the conspiracy had their assets seized and transferred to public ownership. International agreements that limited Burkina Faso's sovereignty over its resources were unilaterally cancelled. Most dramatically, Ibrahim announced the creation of a sovereign wealth fund that would accumulate revenues from resource extraction for future generations, rather than allowing immediate consumption by foreign shareholders. The economic transformation accelerated as Ibrahim's government gained complete control over the country's mineral wealth. New partnerships were negotiated with companies from diverse countries, ensuring that no single foreign power could dominate Burkina Faso's economy. These agreements included technology transfer requirements, local employment quotas, and environmental protection standards that previous governments had been unable or unwilling to enforce. Ibrahim's personal evolution during this period was remarkable. The pressure of governing during crisis had transformed him from a military officer with nationalist ideas into a sophisticated statesman capable of complex diplomatic and economic negotiations. He mastered the intricacies of international finance, commodity markets, and geopolitical strategy while maintaining his connection to ordinary citizens and their concerns. The international response to these changes was fierce and sustained. Economic sanctions were imposed by Western countries, diplomatic relations were downgraded, and Burkina Faso was excluded from various international forums and programs. However, these measures had limited impact because Ibrahim had anticipated such reactions and developed alternative relationships with non-Western partners who were eager to access the country's resources under fair terms. China emerged as a crucial partner, offering infrastructure development projects financed through resource-backed loans rather than the conditional aid packages favored by Western donors. Russian companies provided mining technology and expertise, while Turkish and Indian businesses invested in manufacturing and agricultural processing facilities. These diverse partnerships reduced Burkina Faso's dependence on any single foreign power while providing access to technology and capital needed for development. The domestic impact of these changes was transformational. Government revenues increased dramatically as foreign companies paid fair market prices for resources, rather than the discounted rates negotiated by previous corrupt administrations. This additional income funded massive investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure that began changing citizens' daily lives in concrete and measurable ways. Ibrahim's approach to wealth distribution was carefully balanced between immediate needs and long-term development goals. While some revenues were used for urgent social programs and infrastructure projects, a significant portion was invested in the sovereign wealth fund that would provide economic security for future generations. This approach followed successful models from countries like Norway and the United Arab Emirates, which had used resource revenues to build lasting prosperity rather than temporary consumption booms. The cultural renaissance that accompanied economic transformation was equally important. Ibrahim promoted African languages, history, and cultural practices that had been marginalized during colonial and post-colonial periods. Educational curricula were revised to emphasize local knowledge and perspectives while maintaining high academic standards. This cultural revival strengthened national identity and reduced psychological dependence on foreign validation and approval. Regional leadership became another dimension of Ibrahim's expanding influence. Other African countries watched Burkina Faso's transformation with great interest, seeing a potential model for their own struggles with foreign exploitation and corruption. Ibrahim began hosting conferences and exchanges where African leaders could share experiences and develop coordinated approaches to common challenges. The military reforms implemented during this period created a new model for African armed forces. Instead of serving primarily to protect corrupt elites and their foreign partners, the military was restructured to focus on national defense and development support. Soldiers participated in infrastructure construction projects, educational programs, and community development, initiatives that strengthened civilian-military relations while building practical skills. Ibrahim's family life remained remarkably stable, despite the enormous pressures of leadership. His wife Ajara continued teaching while supporting her husband's mission, and their children attended local public schools rather than exclusive institutions favored by political elites. This personal example reinforced Ibrahim's message that national transformation required leaders who shared the experiences and challenges of ordinary citizens. The assassination attempts and security threats that inevitably accompanied such radical changes were handled with characteristic, calm and strategic thinking. Ibrahim refused to retreat into isolated bunkers or surround himself with foreign bodyguards, instead relying on loyal military units and community-based security networks. This approach maintained his connection to the people while demonstrating confidence in his policies and support-based international. Media coverage of these events was heavily influenced by corporate and government interests that opposed Ibrahim's nationalist agenda. Western news outlets portrayed the changes as dangerous instability that threatened regional security and economic development. However, independent journalists and African media sources provided more balanced coverage that highlighted the positive impacts of reform on ordinary citizens' lives. The one-year anniversary of Ibrahim's government provided an opportunity to assess the remarkable changes that had occurred. Burkina Faso had transformed from a resource colony serving foreign interests into a sovereign nation, controlling its own economic destiny. While challenges remained significant, the foundation had been laid for sustained development that would benefit current and future generations of citizens. The success of these reforms inspired similar movements across Africa, as other countries began questioning their own relationships with foreign powers and international economic systems. Ibrahim's example demonstrated that small, seemingly powerless nations could successfully challenge global power structures if they had strong leadership, popular support, and carefully planned strategies for transformation. 2 years into his leadership, Ibrahim stood before the newly constructed National Assembly building, watching as representatives from every province arrived for the first democratic elections since the transformation began. The irony was not lost on him. He had gained power through military action but was now voluntarily submitting his authority to civilian democratic processes, something rare in African politics and unprecedented for someone who had successfully accumulated such vast control over national resources. The building itself symbolized the broader changes occurring throughout Burkina Faso. Constructed entirely with local materials and labor, funded by revenues from fairly negotiated mining contracts, It represented the country's new economic independence. Solar panels provided clean energy, rainwater collection systems ensured sustainable water supply, and the architectural design incorporated traditional African elements alongside modern functionality. Foreign contractors had not been needed, demonstrating growing local capacity and expertise. Ibrahim's decision to organize democratic elections had surprised both supporters and critics. Many military leaders who had gained power in similar circumstances across Africa had found reasons to delay or manipulate electoral processes. However, Ibrahim understood that lasting transformation required popular legitimacy that could only come through genuine democratic participation. His confidence in this approach reflected his belief that citizens would support leaders who delivered real improvements in their lives. The economic foundation for this democratic experiment was unprecedented in Burkina Faso's history. The sovereign wealth fund established after the failed coup attempt had grown to over $50 billion, making it one of the largest per capita in the world. This massive accumulation of resources from fairly priced mineral exports provided a financial cushion that allowed political experimentation without risking economic collapse or dependence on foreign aid. Campaign season revealed the depth of social transformation that had occurred under Ibrahim's leadership. Political parties emerged representing diverse viewpoints and constituencies, but all operated within a framework that accepted national sovereignty and resource control as fundamental principles. Even opposition candidates supported the basic structure of economic nationalism while proposing different approaches to social policy and governance details. Ibrahim's own political party, the Patriotic Movement for Sovereignty and Development, drew support from across ethnic, religious, and regional divisions. The movement's appeal transcended traditional political categories because its achievements had benefited all segments of society. Rural farmers had better access to markets and credit. Urban workers enjoyed improved wages and working conditions. Students received quality education without crushing debt, and elderly citizens had access to health care and social security. The international community watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and concern. Some Western governments had hoped that democratic elections would bring more compliant leaders who would reverse nationalist economic policies. However, polling data consistently showed overwhelming public support for continued resource sovereignty and controlled foreign investment. Democracy in Burkina Faso was likely to reinforce rather than weaken the policies that challenged traditional Western economic dominance. China, Russia, and other non-Western powers saw opportunity in Burkina Faso's democratic transition. They had built strong relationships with Ibrahim's government and hoped that continued cooperation would provide access to valuable resources, while supporting a model of development that emphasized sovereignty over subordination. These countries offered technical assistance and election monitoring services that helped legitimize the democratic process. The election campaign period became a celebration of national achievement and future possibilities. Citizens who had lived through decades of poverty despite their country's natural wealth could now envision prosperity for themselves and their children. The psychological transformation was as important as material improvements. People felt pride in their country and confidence in their ability to shape their own destiny. Ibrahim's campaign strategy focused on concrete achievements rather than abstract promises. He organized tours of new schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that had been built with domestic resources rather than foreign aid. Citizens could see and touch the evidence of transformation while hearing detailed plans for future development projects. This approach contrasted sharply with traditional political campaigns that relied primarily on ethnic appeals or unrealistic promises. Opposition candidates faced the difficult challenge of criticizing a government that had delivered unprecedented improvements in living standards while maintaining broad popular support. Some focused on concerns about military influence in civilian government, while others proposed alternative approaches to international relations or domestic social policy. However, none dared to suggest returning to the economic relationships that had characterized previous administrations. The economic data supporting Ibrahim's record was overwhelming. Gross domestic product had increased by over 300% during his first 2 years in office, while poverty rates had decreased dramatically. Government revenues from resource extraction, had funded universal primary education, basic healthcare coverage, and rural electrification projects that connected previously isolated communities to national grids. These achievements created a powerful foundation for democratic legitimacy. Regional security challenges provided another dimension of Ibrahim's leadership during this period. Terrorist organizations operating in neighboring Mali and Niger had repeatedly threatened Burkina Faso's stability, hoping to exploit political transitions and resource conflicts. However, Ibrahim's military background and strategic approach had strengthened national defense capabilities while building cooperative relationships with neighboring countries facing similar security threats. The military's role in the democratic transition was carefully managed to ensure civilian supremacy while maintaining effective defense capabilities. Ibrahim established clear boundaries between military and civilian authority, creating institutional mechanisms that would survive changes in political leadership. This approach addressed international concerns about military involvement in politics, while recognizing the continued importance of strong defense forces in an unstable regional environment. Youth engagement in the political process exceeded all expectations. Young people who had previously felt excluded from national decision-making enthusiastically participated in voter registration drives, campaign activities, and policy discussions. Many ran for local and national offices, bringing fresh perspectives and energy to political institutions. The demographic transformation of political leadership reflected broader social changes occurring throughout the country. Women's participation in politics also increased dramatically during this period. Ibrahim's government had implemented policies promoting gender equality in education and employment, creating conditions for increased female political participation. Several prominent women emerged as leaders in different political parties, and electoral laws included provisions ensuring significant female representation in the new National Assembly. The environmental dimension of Burkina Faso's transformation became increasingly important as the country developed its resource extraction industries. Ibrahim insisted on strict environmental protection standards that exceeded international requirements, recognizing that sustainable development required balancing economic growth with ecological preservation. These policies created new industries focused on environmental technology and renewable energy that diversified the economy beyond mining and agriculture. International investors began to see Burkina Faso as a stable and profitable destination, despite initial concerns about nationalist economic policies. The country's transparent legal system, skilled workforce, and reliable infrastructure attracted businesses seeking long-term partnerships rather than short-term extraction opportunities. Foreign direct investment increased substantially, but under terms that ensured technology transfer and local benefit sharing. As election day approached, Ibrahim reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought his country to this historic moment. From a poor military officer studying geological surveys to a national leader presiding over democratic elections, his personal transformation mirrored that of Burkina Faso itself. The hidden billions in natural resources had been revealed and harnessed for national development, creating possibilities that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The final campaign rallies drew enormous crowds in cities and villages across the country. Citizens who had lived through the uncertainty of military transition now had the opportunity to choose their future leaders through free and fair elections. International observers, including delegations from the African Union and other regional organizations, confirmed that the electoral process met international standards for democratic participation and transparency. 5 years after that first radio announcement that changed everything, Ibrahim sat in his simple office reviewing the morning reports that would have seemed impossible during his childhood in Ouagadougou's dusty streets. Burkina Faso had become the fastest-growing economy in Africa, with a sovereign wealth fund exceeding $200 billion and a per capita income that ranked among the highest on the continent. More importantly, this wealth was being shared broadly rather than concentrated in the hands of a privileged few. The democratic elections had resulted in Ibrahim's overwhelming victory, but more significantly, they had established institutional frameworks that would outlast any individual leader. The new constitution included provisions protecting resource sovereignty, requiring transparent management of national wealth, and ensuring that future governments could not easily reverse the fundamental changes that had transformed the country. These safeguards reflected lessons learned from other resource-rich nations where political changes had led to renewed foreign exploitation. The morning's first report detailed the completion of the Trans-Saharan University, a revolutionary educational institution that attracted students from across Africa and beyond. Built entirely with domestic resources and designed by local architects, the university specialized in geology, engineering, sustainable development, and African studies. International students paid tuition in local currency, strengthening Burkina Faso's financial independence while sharing knowledge and expertise across continental boundaries. The university represented Ibrahim's vision for intellectual sovereignty alongside economic independence. Rather than sending their brightest students abroad where many never returned, African countries could now access world-class education within their own continent. The curriculum emphasized practical problem-solving skills needed for African development challenges while maintaining rigorous academic standards that earned international recognition and respect. The second report contained updates from the National Development Bank, an institution that had grown from Ibrahim's early dreams into a powerful engine for domestic investment and entrepreneurship. Using revenues from the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the bank provided low-interest loans to local businesses, farmers, and individuals pursuing education or starting enterprises. This approach created economic opportunities for ordinary citizens while reducing dependence on foreign aid and investment. Small businesses flourished under this supportive financial environment. Local entrepreneurs developed manufacturing operations that processed raw materials within Burkina Faso, rather than exporting them for processing elsewhere. Textile factories used locally grown cotton, food processing plants added value to agricultural products, and technology companies developed software solutions for African markets. These industries created employment opportunities and retained more economic value within the country. The third report detailed progress on the Continental Resource Management Institute, an ambitious project that would train leaders from across Africa in strategies for protecting and developing their country's natural resources. Ibrahim had proposed this initiative during a recent African Union summit, arguing that knowledge sharing and cooperation could prevent other nations from experiencing the exploitation that had characterized Burkina Faso's pre-transformation period. This institute reflected Ibrahim's growing influence as a continental leader. His success in challenging foreign economic dominance while maintaining political stability had inspired similar movements across Africa. Leaders from Mali, Niger, Chad, and other countries regularly consulted with his government about strategies for resource management and economic sovereignty. The institute would formalize these relationships while building capacity for broader African renaissance. The environmental report showed remarkable progress in sustainable development practices. Burkina Faso had become a leader in renewable energy technology, with solar and wind installations providing clean electricity to urban and rural areas alike. Reforestation projects were reversing decades of environmental degradation, while sustainable mining practices protected water sources and agricultural land. These achievements demonstrated that resource extraction could coexist with environmental protection when properly managed. Ibrahim's personal life had evolved dramatically alongside his country's transformation. His wife Ajara had become a prominent educator and women's rights advocate, using her position to promote policies that benefited families across all social levels. Their children attended local schools and universities, growing up with a deep understanding of their country's potential and their responsibilities as future leaders. The family continued living modestly despite having access to enormous resources, setting an example for principled leadership. The international dimension of Burkina Faso's success had created new dynamics in global politics and economics. Other developing countries studied the Burkina Faso model as a potential alternative to traditional development approaches that emphasized foreign investment and export-oriented growth. Academic conferences and policy forums regularly featured presentations about resource sovereignty and democratic nationalism as viable paths toward prosperity. Western governments and corporations had gradually adapted to the new reality, Recognizing that confrontational approaches were counterproductive, some companies that had initially resisted fair contract terms eventually returned with more reasonable proposals, accepting that transparent partnerships offered better long-term prospects than exploitative relationships. This evolution demonstrated that fundamental changes in international economic relationships were possible when developing countries maintained unified positions and strategic patience. The military transformation had created a new model for civil-military relations in Africa. Instead of serving as instruments of oppression or foreign intervention, the armed forces had become partners in national development while maintaining strong defense capabilities. Soldiers participated in literacy programs, infrastructure construction, and disaster relief operations that strengthened their connections with civilian communities. This approach had eliminated the traditional tension between military and civilian authority. Regional security cooperation had produced remarkable results in addressing terrorism and cross-border crime. Ibrahim's government had shared intelligence and resources with neighboring countries, while avoiding the foreign military interventions that had complicated security situations in Mali and other nations. This African-led approach to security challenges had proven more effective than international peacekeeping operations that often created additional problems while failing to address root causes of instability. The Sovereign Wealth Fund had become a powerful tool for regional development and South-South cooperation. Burkina Faso invested portions of its accumulated resources in infrastructure projects and development programs across Africa, creating economic partnerships that benefited all participants. These investments included transportation networks, telecommunication systems, and educational institutions that strengthened continental integration while providing returns for Burkina Faso's fund. Cultural renaissance had accompanied economic transformation as citizens rediscovered pride in their heritage and identity. Traditional music, art, and literature experienced renewed popularity, while contemporary creators developed new forms of expression that celebrated African experiences and perspectives. Cultural festivals and exchange programs connected Burkina Faso with other African countries and diaspora communities worldwide, building relationships based on shared identity rather than economic dependence. The success story had attracted international attention from unexpected sources. Progressive politicians and activists in wealthy countries pointed to Burkina Faso as evidence that alternative development models were possible and necessary. Academic researchers studied the transformation as a case study in successful resource management and democratic governance. Even some former critics acknowledged that the changes had produced better outcomes for ordinary citizens than previous policies. Youth development programs had created a generation of confident, skilled young people who saw unlimited possibilities for their futures. Rather than seeking opportunities abroad, many chose to contribute to their country's continued development. University graduates started businesses, pursued advanced research, and entered public service with enthusiasm and optimism. This demographic transformation ensured that progress would continue regardless of changes in political leadership. As Ibrahim prepared for his afternoon meetings with visiting dignitaries from several African countries, he reflected on the journey that had brought Burkina Faso from exploitation to sovereignty. The hidden billions in natural resources had been revealed and transformed into broad-based prosperity. More importantly, the psychological transformation had created a people who understood their worth and potential, ensuring that future generations would never again accept subordination and exploitation. The final report of the morning contained perhaps the most significant news of all. Birth rates had stabilized at sustainable levels, life expectancy had increased dramatically, and educational achievement scores ranked among the highest globally. These indices had